Midnight, 1862. The Confederate state of South Carolina is asleep. In the fields, under a blanket of humidity and stars, hundreds of thousands of black bodies are meant to be resting. Their value is measured in the sweat they will produce at dawn. They are the engine of the most powerful agrarian economy in the world, the foundation of a nation built on the premise that they are not people, but property. But tonight, the property is thinking and planning. In a cramped cabin, a man named Robert Smalls is not sleeping. He's staring into the darkness, running over the plan in his mind for the 1000th time. He is not a soldier, not yet. He is a pilot, an enslaved man trusted with navigating the CSS Planter, a Confederate military steamship, through the treacherous waters of Charleston Harbor. His mind holds maps, schedules, signal codes, the secrets of the Southern war machine. And tonight, he has decided to steal it. What happens in the next 12 hours will be celebrated, a rare story of black brilliance that white history was forced to acknowledge. But Robert Smalls was not an exception. He was a symptom. He was one wave in a tsunami that was already crashing down upon the Confederacy. A tsunami they saw coming, but were utterly powerless to stop. Because while Robert Smalls was planning to steal a ship, 500,000 of his people were executing a plan to steal an entire economic system. They were about to go on strike. The year is 1861. The American Civil War has just begun. The cannons at Fort Sumter have roared, and young white men in gray uniforms are marching off to a fight they believe will be over by Christmas. They are fighting for their rights, their land, their way of life, a way of life built entirely on the backs of enslaved labor. In the North, President Abraham Lincoln is cautious. His primary goal is to preserve the Union. He publicly states he has no intention of interfering with slavery where it exists. He is a politician, navigating a fractured country. But in the slave quarters, in the cotton fields, along the riverbanks, a different conversation is happening. The enslaved people of America are not waiting for a political solution from Washington. They are reading the signs. They are listening to the arguments between their masters. They hear the word war, and they understand something Lincoln does not. War is chaos, and chaos is opportunity. The first thing you have to unlearn is the image of the passive slave, head bowed, waiting for a savior. That image was manufactured after the fact, to make white Americans feel like the heroes of their own story. The truth is far more dangerous. From the moment the first ship landed on the first African coast, there was resistance. Revolts on slave ships, poisonings, sabotage, broken tools, feigned illness. It was a constant, low-grade war of attrition. But the Civil War changed the calculus. It presented a once-in-centuries chance. The armed white men were leaving. The surveillance state was weakening. And there was a new power on the horizon, the Union Army, an enemy of their masters. They didn't know if the Yankees were abolitionists, but they knew they were the enemy of the planter class. And the enemy of my enemy is my potential ally. So, they began to move. At first, it was a trickle. A man here, a family there, slipping away from the plantation and heading towards the sound of the Union drums. They weren't just running from something, they were running to something. To a concept they called the Freedom Forts, Union encampments. When the first Contrabands, as they were crudely called, arrived at Union General Benjamin Butler's door at Fort Monroe in Virginia. It created a crisis. What was the legal status of this property escaping from the enemy? Butler, a clever lawyer, made a monumental decision. He declared them contraband of war, enemy property that could be seized. It was a legal fiction, but it was a start. The door, once sealed shut, was now cracked open. And the enslaved people of the South put their collective shoulder to that door and shoved. This was not a coordinated movement with a central committee. It was a decentralized, organic, brilliant strategy of mass action. Word spread through the grapevine telegraph, a sophisticated network of communication that ran from plantation to plantation, faster than any white man's telegraph wire. News traveled with preachers, with black boatmen on the rivers, with slaves sent on errands. They shared information about Union Army positions, which slave patrollers were where, which routes were safe. They were executing a general strike. The term, coined by later labor movements, fits perfectly. A general strike is when workers collectively withdraw their labor to paralyze an economic system. And that is exactly what happened. The Confederacy's economy was its central nervous system, and its neurons were the enslaved hands that planted and picked the cotton, that worked the iron foundries, that drove the wagons, that cooked the food, that built the fortifications. By simply walking away, they yanked the wires out of the wall. Let's talk numbers, because numbers don't lie, even when people do. Historians estimate that by the end of the war, between 450,000 and 500,000 enslaved people, roughly 1 in every 8, had fled to Union lines. Think about that number. 500,000 people. It was the largest migration in American history to that point. This wasn't just a moral crisis for the Confederacy. It was an existential, economic catastrophe. Cotton production, the lifeblood of the Southern economy, collapsed. In 1860, the South produced 4.5 million bales of cotton. By 1865, that number had plummeted to under 300,000. The fields were empty. The wealth was evaporating. On plantations, the remaining enslaved people engaged in a work slowdown. They knew the master's power was fading. They worked slower, broke more tools, misunderstood orders. The entire system of discipline, built on the threat of the whip, was crumbling. The fear was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, determined resolve. The white South was terrified. They saw their world dissolving before their eyes. Southern newspapers were filled with hysterical accounts of faithful servants suddenly becoming insolent and unmanageable. Diaries of plantation mistresses reveal a deep, chilling fear. They were now outnumbered in their own homes by people they had brutalized for generations, and the thin veneer of paternalistic control had been ripped away. The entire mythology of the happy, loyal slave was exposed as a fraud in real time. And where were these 500,000 people going? They were flooding into Union camps, creating instant cities of freed people. They came with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a ferocious desire to claim their freedom. And they didn't come empty-handed. They brought intelligence, they brought their labor, and they brought a clear message: we are here to fight. This is the second lie they told you, that the Union Army, full of noble white abolitionists, marched south and freed the slaves. The truth is, the slaves started freeing themselves first, and the Union Army was forced to catch up. They presented Lincoln, Grant, and Sherman with an accompli. They forced the issue of emancipation onto the national agenda. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 was not a sudden burst of moral clarity. It was a military and political calculation, a recognition of the new reality that the enslaved people themselves had created. It was, in effect, the federal government ratifying a victory that Black Americans were already winning on the ground. It transformed the war from a conflict to save the Union into a crusade for freedom, and it prevented European powers like Britain and France from recognizing the Confederacy. The proclamation was a thunderclap, but the enslaved had been building the storm clouds for 2 years. And then they picked up rifles. The same men and women who had been treated as property now became soldiers. The United States Colored Troops, the USCT, were formed. Nearly 200,000 black men, the vast majority of them recently emancipated, enlisted. They did not fight for a country that had always oppressed them. They fought for the future of their people. They fought for their own definition of freedom. They fought with a bravery that stunned their white commanders and enraged their Confederate enemies. At the Battle of Fort Wagner, the 54th Massachusetts Colored Infantry led a suicidal assault on a Confederate stronghold. They were cut down in waves, but they proved, beyond a doubt, that black men would fight and die for their freedom. Their sacrifice was a propaganda victory for the North and a nightmare for the South. The South's reaction to black soldiers was one of pure, unadulterated terror. The Confederate government declared that captured black soldiers would not be treated as prisoners of war, but as insurrectionists, a crime punishable by death. The Fort Pillow Massacre, where Confederate troops under Nathan Bedford Forrest murdered hundreds of surrendering black soldiers, was the most horrific example of this policy. They understood that armed black men were the ultimate repudiation of their entire worldview. It was one thing for a slave to run away. It was another for him to turn around and come back as a liberator, with a gun in his hand and a uniform on his back. But let's go back to the strike, because the military contribution, as vital as it was only one part of the story. The economic sabotage was just as devastating. Consider the scorched earth strategy of General William Tecumseh Sherman on his march to the sea. His army lived off the land and destroyed everything in its path. But Sherman's march was only possible because of the intelligence and labor provided by the formerly enslaved. They acted as his scouts. They knew the land, the hidden paths, the location of food stores. They repaired his railroads and bridges. They were the logistics corps that made his blitzkrieg possible. And as Sherman's army advanced, it acted as a magnet, pulling thousands more enslaved people out of the plantations in its wake. It was a moving, breathing revolution. The sight of that blue column, followed by a massive train of freed black people, was the physical manifestation of the Confederacy's death. This should be the cornerstone of how we understand the Civil War. It should be taught as a story of a dual revolution, a military conflict between the Union and the Confederacy, and a social revolution from below, led by 4 million black Americans who seized their moment and shaped their own destiny. They were not the objects of history, they were its subjects. They were the architects of their own liberation. But this is not the story that was told. After the war, during the brief dawn of Reconstruction, there was a chance to cement this truth. Black men voted, held political office, and served in state militias. They were building a new South on the ashes of the old. But the white South, and eventually a complacent North, could not tolerate this narrative. It was too empowering. It was too dangerous. So, they began to erase it. They replaced it with the myth of the lost cause. The Lost Cause was a deliberate, systematic campaign of historical revisionism. It argued that the Confederacy fought for a noble, constitutional principle of states' rights, not slavery. It painted the Old South as a genteel, civilized world of benevolent masters and happy slaves. In this carefully constructed lie, there was no room for 500,000 striking slaves. There was no room for black agency. In the Lost Cause mythology, enslaved people were loyal to their masters until the very end. They were passive, childlike, and utterly dependent on white guidance. Freedom was a gift bestowed upon them by Lincoln and the North, a gift they were tragically unprepared to handle. This lie was carved into stone, in monuments to Confederate soldiers that still dot the landscape. It was woven into the plot lines of films like The Birth of a Nation, which portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as heroes and black men as savage brutes. It was taught in school textbooks for generations. It became the accepted history, not because it was true, but because it was useful. It served to justify the re-imposition of white supremacy under Jim Crow. It allowed the North and South to reconcile at the expense of black freedom. If the truth was known that black people had, through their own courage and collective action, shattered the Confederacy, it would have undermined the entire foundation of Jim Crow. How can you claim to be superior to a people who outmaneuvered you economically and strategically? How can you argue they are unfit to vote when they proved themselves masters of political and military strategy? They couldn't. So they buried it. They buried the story of the Grapevine Telegraph, a communications network more resilient than the Confederate Postal Service. They buried the story of the work slowdowns and the sabotage. They buried the full scale and impact of the Exodus. They reduced Robert Smalls to a colorful anecdote instead of a symbol of a mass movement. They turned the USCT into a footnote rather than the vanguard of liberation. The truth is, the Civil War was the first modern war, and the general strike of the enslaved was the first modern mass protest. It was a strategy of non-cooperation and economic withdrawal that would inspire Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. It was a testament to the power of collective action, of a people united by a single goal: freedom. The legacy of this erasure is still with us today. It fuels the myth of black passivity. It allows for the perpetuation of the white savior complex. It obscures the deep historical roots of black economic and political power. But when you know the truth, history looks different. The Emancipation Proclamation looks less like a gift and more like a treaty. The Union victory looks less like a Northern conquest and more like a coalition win, with Black Americans as a crucial partner. The collapse of the Confederacy looks less like a military defeat and more like a system-wide societal breakdown engineered from within. So the next time someone romanticizes the Old South, or questions the capabilities of black people, or portrays slavery as a benign institution, remember the Great Strike. Remember the 500,000 who voted with their feet. Remember the empty cotton fields that bankrupted the Confederacy. Remember the contraband camps that became cities of free people. Remember the USCT soldiers who charged Fort Wagner knowing they would likely die, but understanding that their sacrifice was a down payment on the future. Remember Robert Smalls not as an exception, but as one of thousands of pilots, cooks, blacksmiths, and field hands who stole the Confederacy's wealth, its labor, and its secrets right out from under it. They were not waiting for freedom, they were marching towards it. They were not begging for a place in history, they were carving it out with their own hands. They didn't just help win the Civil War. In a very real sense, they started it and they finished it. The general strike of the enslaved is the most successful labor action in American history, and it is the single greatest act of black resistance on this continent. It is a story of breathtaking courage, strategic genius, and world-changing power. And that is exactly why you've never heard the full story until now. Because the most dangerous thing in the world to any oppressive system is a people who realize they don't have to comply. A people who realize that their power does not come from the master's house, but from their own collective will. They proved that the system could not function without them. And in that realization, they found the key to their own chains. They erased this story because it is a blueprint. A blueprint for how to dismantle an empire from the bottom up. A blueprint they never, ever want you to find. But now you have it. But now you have it, and a blueprint is useless if it stays locked in a drawer. This knowledge is not a relic, it is a weapon, and it's time to use it. Right now, in school boards across this country, they are voting to put the erasure back in place. They are banning books that tell black stories. They are passing laws that make it illegal to teach this critical race theory, a boogeyman term for the simple, unvarnished truth you just witnessed. They are terrified of this blueprint because they know it still works. So here is your mission, your part in this war they never ended. First, share this knowledge. You have just been armed with the truth that was hidden for 150 years. Do not let it stop with you. Share this video right now. Send it to the person who needs to see it most. Share it with the caption, "They didn't free us, we freed ourselves." Break the algorithm of ignorance. Make this video so viral that the textbooks have no choice but to acknowledge it. Second, demand the curriculum. Go to your local school board meeting. Email your child's teacher. Ask one simple, powerful question. When will you teach about the general strike of the enslaved and the black militias of Reconstruction? Do not accept "it's not in the standards" for an answer. Standards change when we demand they change. Be the voice that forces this story out of the shadows and into the classroom where it belongs. Third, support the storytellers. They erased this history by controlling the narrative. We reclaim it by supporting those who are telling the truth. Find the historians, the authors, the filmmakers, the creators who are unearthing these stories. Amplify them, fund them, buy their books, watch their documentaries. We are in a battle for memory, and we must fund our own army. Fourth, get ready. This was not the only story they buried. The history of this country is a palimpsest, a document where they wrote their lies over our truths. But the ink is fading. We are scraping away the falsehoods, one video, one lesson, one shared post at a time. We have more stories to tell. The Battle of Liberty Place, the Tulsa Massacre, the Black Panther Party's survival programs, the true scope of COINTELPRO. This is a series. We are just getting started. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, because we are not just a history channel. We are a resistance movement. We are arming you with the most dangerous weapon in existence, the truth. And we are just getting started. The next time they try to tell you a lie about your own past, you will not just have the facts, you will have the fire. Let's go.